In many ways, games are better than they've ever been. They're more ambitious, they look better than ever, they're larger in scale than ever, and the quality of life and accessibility features continue to improve rapidly. As a medium, games have grown a great deal in more ways than one, and to say that we see no evidence of that would be dishonest, to say the least. As ever though, there's room for nuance here, because though it's true that games are bigger and better than ever, in other ways, they also exhibit more crippling issues than they ever have in the past. No, we're not talking about the many ways the games industry itself has grown deeply unhealthy, from widespread layoffs to ballooning development budgets. We're talking about the games themselves, and how it seems like we get incredibly buggy or even downright broken game releases with alarming frequency. There has been no shortage of such releases in recent years, prominent AAA titles that launch on the back of months, if not years, of hype and anticipation, only to end up disappointing, at least with the technical state that they launch in. Many of these games end up fixing themselves over time, while many are legitimately good games in their own right, even if they have their technical problems. And yet, the state in which they launch is almost too egregious. Or would have been if our standards for the technical state of games at launch hadn't plummeted the way that they have over the years. Cyberpunk 2077's disastrous launch in 2020 was a prominent example, with the game being next to unplayable on PS4 and Xbox One to the extent that not only did the game end up being delisted from the PlayStation Store until CDPR had fixed it at least a little bit, but CD Projekt even got hit with multiple lawsuits as a result. The Switch's generation Pokemon games have also been notable instances of horribly unoptimized launches. Pokemon Sword and Shield were problematic, while Scarlet and Violet were downright broken at times, and those games didn't get too much fixing either, unlike the aforementioned Cyberpunk 2077. Last year, we got Starfield, which may have been a relatively more stable game than, say, Fallout 76 was at launch, which, incidentally, is yet another example of a major broken launch. But still, it had a litany of technical issues that dragged the experience down for many. That same year, another flagship Bethesda release in Redfall had its own share of similar flaws. Earlier this year, meanwhile, we had Star Wars Outlaws, which may not have been quite as broken as Redfall was, but was woefully underpolished nonetheless, something that the developer itself has admitted to more than a few times, and vowed to address with its next major release, Assassin's Creed Shadows. Much more recently, we also had Stalker 2 Heart of Chernobyl, though that's obviously a very unique scenario, with developer GSC Game World having been faced with unprecedented challenges during the game's development that were obviously completely out of the studio's control, which, combined with the scale and complexity of the game itself, makes its many bugs and tech flaws much more understandable than in most other cases. Obviously, no developer wants to release a broken or unpolished game, so why is it that we're seeing that happen with increasing frequency? As you might imagine, the answer is not a simple one. The reasons are numerous, ranging from self-inflicted problems to external complications, but ultimately, the majority of the factors contributing to the growing epidemic point to systemic issues with the games industry itself and the direction it continues to head in. Put a pin in that for now though, we'll be back. It should go without saying that the existence of bugs in games isn't inherently or unexpected or unreasonable by any means. As a crossroads of art and technology and a melting pot of a multitude of different creative and technical fields, game development is a chaotic beast. When a developer says that any game getting made is nothing short of a miracle, you know they mean it. There's 1,000 different things that can go wrong during the process, which means that technical issues and bugs are always going to find their way through, no matter what. And now that games are larger, more complex, and more ambitious than ever, and their development entails more time and larger workforces than ever, the room for error has only grown. So, the increase in technically unstable games makes sense from that perspective. There's also the fact that the way developers themselves approach a project and its development has changed in fundamental ways. Going gold no longer means what it once did. Even after a game is launched, that doesn't necessarily mean development is over, even for single-player games, and especially for multiplayer ones. Now the developers have the ability to continue polishing and improving a game even after it's been released. Releasing in a poor technical state no longer seems as final as it once did, because it literally isn't. The list of games that have launched broken but gone on to redeem themselves with incessant updates and significant, wide-ranging fixes is a longer one and grows longer by the day. And while the efforts of the developers in those cases deserve to be lauded, there's just as many, if not many more, examples of games that don't get anywhere close to that sort of post-launch care and attention. On paper, the fix should be simple enough, right? Developers need more time to polish and optimize their games, so just take more time. Simple enough? If only, because of course that's where the ugly commercial constraints come into the industry. Games might be bigger and more complex than ever, which means that they require more time in the oven. And though sometimes they do certainly get more time, more often than not there's only so much that a publisher's going to delay a game. On some level, that's obviously understandable, but things do get problematic when publishers end up releasing games that they know are broken, and not nearly in a technical condition that they should be. And yet they choose to roll the dice anyway, because more delays would mean more time and more money and more investments. Then of course, you have circumstances that vary from project to project, depending on a number of different factors. Take, for instance, the different toolset that a developer might be working with to make a game, and the complications that the toolset might have inherent to it. We touched on Starfield and the Pokemon games earlier, and both are perfect examples of games that ended up suffering because of the aged aspects and immense tech debts of their respective engines. Similarly, we also see an increasing amount of games built on Unreal Engine 5, on PC in particular, that suffer from traversal stuttering and shader compilation issues, among a ton of other things. Last year's Star Wars Jedi Survivor was a prominent example. Previously, we've also seen BioWare games struggling on the technical front due to the development issues that were brought on by having to work with the Frostbite engine, with both Anthem and Mass Effect Andromeda having had a litany of such problems. There's also the fact that developers often have to work with a wide range of machines, each with their own specs, which means multi-platforming games in particular end up having to deal with an exponentially higher number of potential complications. Not only do you have PS5, PS5 Pro, Xbox Series X, Xbox Series S, and the Switch, you also have an infinite range of PC specs to consider as well, while many of the games that are releasing are still cross-gen, which means that they have to deal with PS4, Xbox One, and their respective variants as well. Oh, and there's the Steam Deck, while soon enough, devs will also have the Switch 2 to deal with. It's a bit much, to be plain. Even in and of itself, this would have been a huge factor, but as we've touched on, developing games is a massively complicated task as it is, and throwing this on top adds just more room for error. Multiplayer games have their own share of issues to deal with too. On top of all of the issues of many AAA production, devs working on multiplayer games have to worry about server issues, because boy oh boy do games end up suffering massively from server issues way too often. Just recently, we saw Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024's launch being completely crippled by its server issues. Going back in 2021, stability issues were high on a long list of critical issues for Battlefield 2042. Even with the biggest, most prominent releases, server issues end up being way too common. Smaller developers facing unexpectedly large crowds and having to deal with unforeseen issues is an understandable issue, of course. But when major titles, like a new Battlefield game of all things, can't figure out how to handle large crowds of players upon release, you really have to wonder how things could even get to that point. Now, I'm no game developer, but even from the outside looking in, it's a little overwhelming. Yes, technology now allows devs to create larger, more ambitious, more detailed, and more complex gaming experiences than ever before, but that also means more margins for error. In and of itself, that isn't an unexpected problem. Obviously. The problem arises, however, when you combine that with the inevitable cuts of time and money investments that in-development projects so often end up having to deal with, because more often than not, that leads to either rushed development or development being cut short prematurely. Either way, quality assurance suffers, and bugs that otherwise would end up being caught under ordinary circumstances instead wind up in the shipped version of the game. You do obviously get some exceptions. Nintendo, for instance, has made it a habit of sitting on games until they're ready for release, and I mean truly ready. Super Mario Bros. Wonder's development spoke about how they were given virtually endless time and money to get the game just right, while The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom had technically gone gold a whole year before release, with Nintendo spending the rest of time just polishing the experience. And the results spoke for themselves with both of those games, each among the best of all time in their respective illustrious franchises. It's also no coincidence that development budgets for Nintendo games tend to be tighter compared to most Western AAA projects, while the technology those projects are working with is also obviously much more outdated compared to most other modern hardware. First-party Sony games also often exhibit uncanny levels of polish. It's much more infrequent in this case. We had Helldivers 2's launch server overcrowding issues, for instance, while The Last of Us Part 1's PC port was a total disaster not that long ago. But big flagship releases from PlayStation Studios often come with expectations of polish and sheen, which they do tend to deliver on. Then again, as recent years have made abundantly clear, a lot of that is made possible by the eye-watering amounts of money that Sony throws at these big first-party projects, which is a major issue that not just Sony, the entire industry needs to address at the earliest. But that's a different topic. Ultimately, developers face way too many constraints, while it also doesn't help that too many of them are unwilling to scale back their projects and tackle something that would invite less trouble from a development perspective. Something obviously needs to give, because this current model is only going to remain sustainable for so long. Ultimately, we're going to get to a breaking point where standards for the optimization and the technical health and stability of a game upon release are completely on the floor, and it won't be pretty, to put it mildly. Hopefully, the industry course corrects before it gets to that point. Hey, did you know that we at GamingBolt upload new videos every day? Stick around, drop a like, subscribe, and hit that bell, and let us know what kind of content you'd like to see in the future with a comment below.